In the dry, scorched valleys of Washington state, something almost impossible was unfolding. Land that had been stripped bare by wildfire, left without a single tree, without shade, without any real sign that life would ever return, was suddenly changing. Not because of engineers in hard hats or billion-dollar infrastructure projects, not because of a government program pouring concrete into the earth, because of a handful of animals with flat tails and sharp teeth that most people would never take seriously as problem solvers. Biologists released a small group of beavers onto this ruined land and simply waited. What happened next stunned the scientists themselves. Rivers that had turned sluggish and warm began to recover. Wetlands that had not existed in decades quietly reappeared. And species that had been missing from these valleys for years started showing back up, almost as if they had been waiting for exactly this moment. So how does a single animal accomplish what millions of dollars in engineering and conservation spending could not? Let's find out right now together with Terra Factor. To understand why this story matters so much, you first need to understand how bad things had already gotten long before the fires arrived. Washington state might look like one of the last wild places in the United States from the outside. Glacial rivers, ancient forests, pristine mountain streams. But the reality underneath that image is very different. According to the Center for American Progress, more than 46% of all rivers in the state have been significantly altered by human activity. Nearly 70% of the large rivers have been changed in some way, whether by dams, channeling, or development along their banks. Before European settlers began reshaping the land, floodplain forests and wetlands covered close to half of the landscape surrounding Washington's waterways. These were extraordinary ecosystems, dense, layered environments where the river was not just a river, but the heartbeat of an entire network of life. Birds, insects, fish, amphibians, and mammals all depended on the relationship between the water and the land beside it. Over generations of intensive livestock, grazing, farming, and resource extraction, that relationship was severed. Today, those floodplain forests and wetlands account for barely 2% of the riverside landscape, 2% of what once existed. That is not a decline, that is an erasure. And then, in 2015, before much of what was left had any chance to recover, fire came. A wildfire broke out on the Twisp River, a tributary of the Methau, and burned through more than 11,000 acres. Everything that had been hanging on in that valley, whatever fragile vegetation still lined the banks, whatever insects still lived in the soil, whatever shade still existed over the water, was gone. The land around the river had already been pushed to the edge by a century of human pressure. The fire pushed it over completely. What do you do with a landscape like that? Where do you even begin? The answer that a group of biologists gave was one that most people would not have predicted. You bring back the animal that shaped these rivers for thousands of years before humans ever arrived. Before we go further, if you are watching this and you find yourself genuinely curious about stories where nature does something that defies logic, where a single species or a single decision changes an entire landscape, then Terra Factor is exactly the channel you should be subscribing to right now. Hit that subscribe button and the bell notification so you never miss what we find next, because these stories are not rare. They just do not get told enough. Now back to Washington. Beavers were not a foreign presence in these valleys. They were once the defining feature of the Methau watershed. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, living and working across the river system, building the kind of infrastructure that no human engineer has ever replicated at scale. Then European colonizers came, and the fur trade consumed nearly the entire population within a matter of decades. By the time anyone thought to ask what the rivers looked like without beavers, the answer was already surrounding them, degraded, simplified, vulnerable. The Mythau Beaver Project was launched in 2007 with a straightforward goal: restore what had been taken. After the 2015 wildfire devastated the Twisp River corridor, 3 breeding pairs of beavers were carefully relocated into streams running through Black Canyon, a section of land that the fire had scorched almost completely. The scientists who released them did not know exactly what to expect. The conditions were extreme. The vegetation was minimal. The ground was still bearing the marks of the burn. When researchers returned after the first winter, every single pair had survived. And they had not just survived, they had gone to work. Each of the monitored sites had new dams. On some stretches, there were already 7 or more structures where there had been none before. That number kept climbing. As more beavers were introduced over the following years, the transformation of the landscape accelerated in ways that the data could barely keep up with. Here is the mechanism behind what beavers actually do, and it is worth slowing down to appreciate it. When a beaver builds a dam, it does not simply block water. It restructures the relationship between the river and the land on either side of it. Water backs up behind the dam and spreads outward. It moves sideways into areas that had been dry. It soaks into the ground, raising the water table. It creates a pond where there was only a narrow channel before. That pond becomes a whole world. Plants begin growing at the edges. Insects arrive. Birds follow. Fish find shelter in the deep, cold water. The floodplain, which had been disconnected from the river for decades, starts to reconnect. After the fires, this process becomes something even more dramatic. Scientists who returned to the burned areas around the Twisp River found beaver ponds ringed by living vegetation. Aspen shoots were pushing up through the ground. Willow and cottonwood were taking hold along the water's edge. The contrast between the scorched hillsides above and the recovering riparian zone below was striking. The ponds were functioning as islands of recovery in a landscape that had otherwise been erased. Since 2008, the collaboration between the U.S. Forest Service, Washington State Wildlife Authorities, and salmon recovery partnerships has resulted in more than 300 beavers being released into the upper tributaries of the Mythau system. Those animals built 176 ponds across the project area. Biologists surveyed 62 of them and calculated that those ponds alone hold nearly 5 million gallons of water. Across the entire project zone, the dams built by those 300 beavers are estimated to collect 65 million gallons of water each year. To make that number feel real, that is enough to supply a typical household with drinking water for more than 2 decades. This matters enormously for drought. When rivers run low in summer and the land dries out, beaver ponds act as slow-release reservoirs. They hold water back during wet seasons and release it gradually as temperatures rise and flow drops. Streams that would otherwise run dry in August continue flowing because of the stored water upstream. For a region where drought years are becoming longer and more frequent, that kind of natural water storage is not just useful, it is critical. And then there is the question of fire protection, which brings the story full circle. Researchers from the Mythau Beaver Project documented something remarkable when they went back into the areas burned in 2015. The fire had reached the boundaries of beaver ponds and then stopped. Water does not burn. Wetlands do not ignite the way. Dry brush does. On one side of a pond, the landscape was scorched. On the other side, plants were untouched. One of the ponds was even used directly as a water source by firefighters working the blaze. The beavers had built infrastructure that humans could not have put in place fast enough, even if they had tried. Now let us talk about salmon, because no story about the rivers of Washington State is complete without them. 7 species of salmon depend on this state's waterways. They are born in cold freshwater streams high in the mountains, migrate to the ocean, spend years feeding and growing in open water, and then return to the exact streams where they were born to spawn and die. That journey is extraordinary under any circumstances, but human development has made it dramatically harder. Floodplain forests that once shaded the water and kept it cold have been cleared. Dams have blocked migration routes. Waterways have been channeled and straightened, removing the complexity of habitat that young salmon need to survive. The connection between beaver ponds and salmon recovery is something that researchers have been documenting in real time through a separate effort called the Tulalip Beaver Project. Since 2014, more than 200 beavers have been placed in target areas specifically to improve conditions for juvenile salmon. The ponds that beavers create are cold. They are deep enough to provide refuge from summer heat. They are rich in the aquatic insects that young salmon feed on before they are big enough to begin their journey to the ocean. The plants around the edges shade the water and keep temperatures stable. Biologists working on the project described what they found when they revisited some of the areas where beavers had been introduced. Sites that had been bare, straight channels with almost nothing living in them, had transformed into complex pond systems with a dozen or more dams, deep pools, and thick vegetation. And those ponds, they said, were full of young salmon, not a handful, hundreds of them. The deeper lesson in all of this is one that engineers and ecologists are only beginning to fully absorb. For most of the last century, the instinct when a river was in trouble was to build something: a concrete wall to stop erosion, a dam to store water, a channel to control flooding. These solutions are expensive. They require constant maintenance, and they often fix one problem while creating several others. A beaver dam, by contrast, builds itself, repairs itself after storm damage, adapts to changing conditions, and delivers a cascade of benefits that no single piece of infrastructure could replicate. There is also something worth saying about the beavers themselves. Many of the animals released into these restoration projects were not captured in the wild for this purpose. They were problem animals, beavers that had been flooding someone's field or gnawing through an orchard. Farmers had called wildlife authorities to have them removed. Under the old system, removal often meant killing. Now it means relocation. The same beaver that destroyed someone's apple trees becomes a restoration engineer in a burned-out valley. The instinct to chew and dam and flood, which made it a nuisance in one place, makes it exactly what is needed somewhere else. This is where the story lands. Not with a dramatic conclusion or a final number, but with a principle. Some of the most powerful tools available for healing damaged landscapes are not tools at all. They are animals that have been doing this work for thousands of years in ecosystems that evolved alongside them. When we removed beavers from these river systems, we did not just lose a species, we lost a function, an invisible architecture that held the land and the water together. Restoring that function does not require a billion-dollar budget or a decade of engineering studies. It requires understanding what was lost and having the patience to put it back. 300 beavers in the Upper Maythau, 200 in the Tulalip project, a handful of pairs released onto scorched ground near the Twisp River. The scale seems almost laughably small against the scale of the problem, but the results are not small. The rivers are changing, the wetlands are coming back, the salmon are returning, and the fires, when they come again, will meet a different landscape than they did before. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, then you already know this channel is worth sticking around for. Subscribe to Terra Factor right now if you have not already, and share this video with someone who thinks nature needs billion-dollar solutions to recover. Sometimes, all it takes is a flat tail and a pile of sticks. We will see you in the next one.